Okay, welcome everybody to the first ever video edition of my podcast, Canon Blast History Podcast. If I can get the audio extracted, I will do my best to use this for a podcast episode. If not, I will just do my best to put this up on YouTube so it can make the rounds. My name's Ben. I have with me two of my friends, Sean and Mike, who are also academic historians, but also they do battle reenacting as well as I do, and we all kind of have our foot in both the academic and the living history worlds. But lately, there was a bit of a controversy that I thought would make for an interesting roundtable discussion. There is a reenactment that usually happens in Germantown, Pennsylvania. The local community decided that they no longer wanted it in its traditional form due to prevailing gun violence in the community. And while that's understandable for that particular community, some living history people raised questions as to whether or not this is a good example of reenacting battles being outdated. And to me, that's a much deeper question that definitely want to see a lot more discussion on. But I wanted to see what these guys thought about it. I know both of them have done actual academic research on reenacting, but also we're all biased because we take part in it. So without further ado, if you guys want to introduce yourselves, kind of tell what you reenact and kind of what your take on the utility of the shooting side of reenacting is.
Let's just do introductions first, and then we'll take our takes later. So, because introductions could be a whole different thing.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So, how are y'all doing? My name is Michael Santana. Been reenacting at this point for I want to say 10 years now. Started with my undergraduate at the Citadel, and then from there, after graduating and getting my master's, I've branched into almost every time period conceivable. I've done everything from both sides of the American Civil War, specifically 7th Connecticut in Florida, because they have a strong history there. I've also done 16th century Spanish colonial, 18th century Spanish border companies in St. Augustine. I switched. Sorry, Ben. I've done 20th century, I do American World War One, Spanish Civil War. I portrayed both nationalist and Republican factions, American World War II, as well as Spaniards in World War II. So it's Free French as well as Blue Division, American Korea, and American and Viet Cong, Vietnam. And I'm finally working on a Balearic slinger kit. So again, I've got almost, if you can name a time period, I probably have some item or icon in it. Currently pursuing my doctorate, like Ben is here, except I'm about a year and a half behind you, my dude. So I'm excited. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thanks for helping.
So my name is Sean Kane. I'm a little bit different, I think I'm more of a public historian than I am academic, really, although I do teach class at a college and everything since grad school. But I work at a historic plantation site out here near Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been reenacting for about 5 years or so, 5, 6 years, who can count? So I still feel like a new guy, but I got a few years under my belt with this, mainly doing American Revolution, but I kind of run the gamut mostly of 18th century, whether it's French and Indian Wars. I'm getting more into civilian stuff. And then I dabble into early 18s and through the antebellum period as well on the occasion as I need to do so. That's pretty much my short credential list. I don't have so much extensional or very long list here, so we'll move on from me.
Oh, I just like talking, dude. I'm sorry.
We all do. It's okay. And I mean, for those who've listened to my podcast, they know my bias. I do 18th century maritime. If my background isn't, my literal background isn't apparent enough, but also I do occasionally dabble with World War II American medical because of some family history, but I would say 90% of my stuff's 18th century, spanning from 1670, since we're going to the long 18th century, all the way through 1783. So I do dabble with World War II, but mostly Rev War. and I'm doing my PhD right now, but I am definitely needing to catch up and push to the end. I'm hopefully, knock on wood, almost done.
You're farther than I am, man. I still gotta do comps.
Well, but you know what? It's not a race. You'll get there. Um, okay. So once again, we're talking about the utility of battle reenacting. If it's good for educating the public, if it's just a bunch of people shooting at each other like a movie for no reason. And part of the discussion in that particular community relates to gun violence. And I don't really want to get into that tonight because I think that that's a community specific issue that was brought up. But the bigger questions are: is reenacting even worth it? And I don't mean by worth it being living history. The question was never should people dress up and portray uh, people from a time period. The question is specifically: is shooting battle reenactments a useful thing? So either of y'all want to give your takes or jump on? Go ahead.
So I think it really depends on the kind of the community. And in this special case here with Germantown and Cliveden, they did reach out to the community and trying to figure out, what was exactly best, for the locals around them, what was going on and everything. So, if we're going with this specific case here, which I know you were like, hey, this is a little bit, a case in case here. It, you could say that maybe in this specific part, probably not so much, but as a broader whole, I mean, really what you can do with anything is always going to be utilitarian, it's just how you implement it, I think. But we have to think about audience. You have to think about what you're trying to portray. And, I think a lot of these types of events get a bad rap because it's, usually a bunch of the stereotype is a bunch of overweight men that are, 3 times as old as the soldiers are, standing at 20 yards away, looking like they're shooting at ducks or something. And, it looks silly, to the public. It's not a completely accurate depiction of what happened. Um, and if we take in the case of, is it making light of the violence of war and, what is actually probably would have been actually depicted, in the actual battles, whether it's on the field or not, who can say, whether it actually does true justice. I mean, that's just getting to the nitty gritty, I guess, with the, um, splitting hairs or anything. But I do think, the way they can be implemented is they might have a lot of utility as long as you take into account of what you're trying to portray, the community, the audience, and quite frankly, just do it with a sincerity rather than just a celebration kind of mindset.
You hit the nail on the head with the end, right? Where it's like we're not celebrating this, and at the end of the day, especially with battle reenactments, right? There's this talk of portraying accuracy, like portraying how it really looked. That's Icarus chasing the sun. That's never going to happen, right? Unless you physically have cannonballs bouncing down the field and shattering dudes' chests open and having the ribs puncture the dudes next to them, right? That's not going to happen. Thank Almighty God. That is, we're not going to portray that physically in the field. We want the utility of battle reenacting kind of boils down to just a baser nature of humanity. And I'm going to tell a quick story here. Growing up in Miami, we don't have a lot of historical events, right? Like historical festivals, reenactments, all that doesn't happen in Miami, right? Everyone in Miami thinks history didn't start until 1960 when Cubans showed up to Miami and made it the city it is, right? Like I've had whole fights with people from my own hometown trying to explain to them that humans lived in Miami before 1960. But I digress. So when I remember every summer, my family would travel. And my mother, who grew up in Virginia because my abuelo worked for the American government related to Latin America. There's a whole story there, but we don't have time for it. we would go up to Virginia and that whole area, and we would actually time our visits based on what historical sites we could visit, places like Jamestown, Williamsburg, or if there was a battle reenactment going on. We visited Gettysburg specifically because we knew that there was going to be a battle reenactment going on. Now, I love all that. Now, as an adult, as a mature human who understands all the different aspects, I love all aspects of living history now, right? Like, I can go into a tailor shop and watch a person like tailoring a dress and talking about the silks and the fabrics, and I'm fascinated now, right? That's 28-year-old Michael. 12-year-old Michael wanted to see the cannons go boom, right? 12-year-old Michael wanted to see shit blow up. Sorry, was that too much, Ben?
It's okay. I'll just give you a slap on the wrist for that one.
I apologize. I wanted to see things blow up, right? Like 12-year-old me liked the gunpowder and the excitement and the rushing of horses down the field. I wanted to see something back in Miami. I was never going to get a chance to, right? Living in this massive urban area that didn't think history happened, right? The realest connection to the past I had was going to these public events and watching those horses, feeling the pressure of the gunpowder and the explosions, right? And I'm talking about this in very glowing terms because I get, again, as a something was finally physically there in front of me. Now, was it giving me a complete picture of how everything went down? No, of course it's not, right? And as I get older, right, like, you know, things get more real. Like I start understanding, I start grasping truly the gravity of what these human beings were engaged in. But as a young man, it helped light the spark for what would later become what is now a career. And I think that's the main utility where it reaches people, it reaches, I hate to say especially young boys, because again, that we can get now open a whole can of worms, but for young kids who maybe they don't care about fabric or pottery, but they think explosions are cool, right? That gets them asking all of these questions that they never would have otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with my own journey to history, it came from a pretty, see, even the way you describe your journey into history, it's a lot more gallant than mine. Mine was simply the Patriot movie. So, and I mean, that's another thing that, you know, and Nick knows, we had talked about doing a podcast just talking about the Patriot movie, but it's just kind of been overdone. The more I read reviews of it and podcasts, I just was kind of like, let's do something else.
Almost positive. Brandon made an amazing.
Yeah, Brandon F did. Brandon F did
series.
the whole, and actually, I was going to do a podcast that kind of was like, I don't want to say like counterpoint, but it kind of was counterpoint to Brandon F. But when I talk about the Patriot movie, that, you know, 8-year-old Ben, who had just moved to South Carolina and pretended that he was Benjamin Martin, running around with a cap gun. I mean, that it's as ludicrous as that sounds. Like, that was what got me into history, and my friends in the neighborhood who were part of our colonial army. I mean, you know, there is a like a gateway that reenacting opens that we talked about in one of my previous podcasts with my friend Adam, when we talked about pirates, watching Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, that actually does get people in the history, even if you have to tell people mermaids don't exist. But yeah, there is an action.
The streets of St. Augustine, seeing people dressed as Jack Sparrow while you're in your Spanish colonial stuff, and they try to act buddy to you, and like, we're not the same.
We're not the same.
I think there is a emotive aspect that battle reenactments have. I mean, the burnt, you know, the smell of sulfury burnt powder. You get to see this. It's a spectacle. I mean, and all in all, it's I love them and everything, but they are kind of a spectacle, and it is kind of one you know, one facet that really does draw a lot of people in. You know, at least for I guess say most of males that are in the hobby. I would say I'm not really sure how many of the ladies that are drawn into the hobby, seeing a bunch of, hot, sweaty, wool wearing uniformed men marching across the field or anything. A lot of times, well, that's a whole nother debacle. We don't want to go into that. That'll be way into the weeds, but it does draw people in. But I think, the heart of it is like, is it an accurate depiction of both the history and the hobby? I mean, when we talk about living history, a lot of people tend to conflate it as battle reenactments, and there's a lot of people, there's a lot of good writing on how to distinct between a reenactor and a living historian and all that type of thing, because you can do battle reenactments and do living history at the same time, but it's kind of like squares in a rectangle. They're not always the same thing.
Well, let's lay out, if we can, I don't want to interrupt, but like, let's lay out definitions for people who don't know, because for us, like, it's pretty apparent what a living historian and a reenactor is, but do y'all want to tell what the difference is?
Let's go with just a kind of a textbook definition, and someone can add or maybe like mold it around a little better than me. But a reenactor, in the basic terms, usually is just, this is going to be the super simplistic terms, it's just someone that just shows up for reenactments. They're not always simply for maybe every facet of living history, so to speak. They're more of they go to these the battle reenactments. They don the uniforms. They do as best as they can and things like that. Living history is kind of everything not outside of it, but added on to it. Reenacting is really just a small portion of living history, because you can do living history outside of commemorations and anniversaries and things like that. That's maybe my super simplistic way of looking at it, and there's probably a whole lot more definition to it, but I don't want to get too much into semantics here.
I mean, that's definitely it. I mean, for me, it's like living history is Williamsburg, reenacting is a war movie. I mean, that's sort of the even more simplistic.
That's not a bad one. So
yeah,
I'd argue this: every living historian is a reenactor.
Yeah,
but not every reenactor is a living historian.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to go for: squares and rectangles.
Yeah, so kind of reenacting as a whole is just trying to recreate or give the appearance of how an event might have looked.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah,
that's the basic. Living history goes deeper. So reenacting is just right. Okay, this is the battle. You have men running around in a uniform. You'll have women doing various services in different areas, and that's the reenacting. Ta-da! Congratulations, you wore the cool uniforms and got to drink with your friends. Nothing wrong with that last part, by the way. That last part is
that's going to happen regardless.
that last part is half the reason I continue with this hobby.
But to be fair, there are national park living history juried events I've been to where Friday night hits, you're drinking. I mean, that's just the nature of any subculture, I feel
Friday night, Friday day. Anyway,
yeah.
No, in all seriousness, but living history gets deeper. Living history is, you're not just looking at the soldier or the camp follower or the medical personnel during the battle. You are trying to explain the entire cultural, social world that human being resides in. Yeah. And the mental state that human has to deal with as they're watching torn and shattered and broken boys, mostly, coming back into the camp, seeing friends get blown to bits, commanders having to make decisions while understanding the own consequences of their actions, right? And the mental state that human of that social class and training and background, how they would have reacted as in that role, that's living history. And what we're getting at, and I think we're all kind of dancing around this little bush here, because we kind of all agree on this. What battle reenactments do is allow for a space to living historians to creep in a way that's mainstream and palatable to your general public, right? One of the things, so going back to my Gettysburg example, I remember when we went to Gettysburg, the battle got canceled Yeah, the reenactment battle got canceled the year that my family finally saved up the money that we'd be able to drive from Miami to finally go see it. Yeah, no, it got canceled.
Mm.
Yet, yeah, I know. I couldn't see the big marching columns of men fake beating the crap out of each other.
Yeah.
But what was amazing is that there at Gettysburg, you had large numbers of different living historians, right? People who, in spite of the battle being canceled, right, because there was still a large audience of human beings there that had come for the reenactment, they used that opportunity to have real living historian encampments, right, talking about various social cultural aspects of the American Civil War, talking about the reactions of Gettysburg civilians watching the armies pass by, of the medical encampments preparing for the new people, of the soldiers, right, of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia readying themselves for battle. And why would Army of Northern Virginia even target Gettysburg? Oh, shoes, right? Like little things like that. But the fact like living historians were there and able to use the space created by the publicity of the reenactment to help spark interest in this family who wasn't even here in the American Civil War. My family was chilling in Cuba when that popped off, right? Like, but it still helped people connect to the past of their adopted nation.
But you told me they were involved in some other military conflicts at the time, so fighting the Spanish and
I don't know. That's a whole story. I'm not sure which side they were on in the
yeah,
various Cuban independence wars.
yeah.
Doesn't matter.
I think too. Speaking of Civil War, not going to get into the whole culture war over the Civil War, but it does bring me to another aspect of reenacting and social stigma. So, when you reenact, most people who've seen movies like Sweet Home Alabama or The Patriot know reenactors by definition are weird people. We're all nerds who dress up as living history folks, male or female, soldier, civilian, whatever, to do something in the past. But there is, I feel like, some misunderstanding by the general public, perhaps not helped by the fact that reenactors don't always behave, about what reenactors' motives are. And I think that does tie into some of the things we see with cases like Germantown, where people are like, we've got a gun violence issue in our town. Why do we want a bunch of old guys shooting at each other? But I mean, in my life, I had a college president in my undergrad who Mike knows of, who dressed as a Confederate officer once, and uh, some students, I guess, took the picture of him out of context because he portrayed both sides, North and South, and said, "Look, this guy cosplays as a rebellious, Southern plantation owner. We don't want him to be president of the college." And in reality, having known him personally, he was just at an event where he portrayed both sides. So, what is y'all's opinion on the public's understanding of reenacting, and do we do a good enough job of explaining why we're out there? Because I'll be honest, I've been to World War II events where I've seen guys in German uniforms going off to a bar after not having changed, and as an American of Jewish heritage, I cringe, and I understand why the public does too. Um,
Well, I think it has something to do with just uh I think this is a multifaceted thing. It's like a sincerity of approach. Whether it's I don't want to say genuine, but that's the only word I can think of. As well as just I guess in certain hobbies, I'm not really sure if this is going to be the case for maybe something like Rev War reenacting or anything, but there are some facets of it where it could be culturally or something like rather insensitive or maybe tone deaf in some cases. I know that for the last about half decade or so with Black Lives Matter movements and things like that, that Civil War reenacting has been kind of the whipping boy of this hobby as far as the PR comes along. But there are other parts of it where you're saying with the World War II, and you have a lot of Jewish Americans or Americans of Jewish descent that might see people in maybe not even just Wehrmacht uniforms, but SS and all sorts of things. And it's kind of like, what message are you giving? And historically, reenactments are always kind of about commemoration, celebration, things like that. A lot of times, especially with the bicentennial and centennial, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s for Rev War and Civil War. And I think really in some cases, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I swear I will come up to hopefully a neat little point towards the end of this tirade, is that with Civil War, I think what a lot of people are miffed about it is that in the past, it's always kind of missed the mark about what you're doing with your portrayal. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with trying to do both sides of Confederate and Union. You can't do a reenactment if you don't have the bad guys on the other side. But I think it's because a lot of people, and I'm going to go stereotyping here a little bit, but I do know a lot of, Confederate reenactors. A lot of them are pretty decent people, and you do have some of the crazy ones that are louder than others that kind of ruin, the whole thing for everyone else. And it does become culturally and tone deaf, for the portrayal as to like the roots of the war, the start of it. And, all in all, there's nothing wrong with portraying a soldier of the Confederacy that's like, I just picked up a rifle because I'm fighting for, Virginia, or I'm a German soldier that I'm 17 and, lied about my age and got sucked into the Wehrmacht and I wanted to fight, for the Deutschland and stuff like that. But I think it's just, as much as you try to humanize it, it tends to kind of miss the broader context of why these conflicts were happening. Because we're talking about battles, we're talking about something that's a part of a giant war, and wars don't happen out of a vacuum. They happen for specific reasons, and a lot of times there is a lot of ideology at the heart of it. And like I said, a lot of times I think the battle reenactments kind of miss the mark as to what's going on. A lot of Rev War reenactments, the visitors always want to see the Continentals beat back the British because, boo Cornwallis, or you want to see the Union defeat the Greys, or you want to see the American GIs defeat the Germans or anything like that. But it's never really about what's going on at the heart of this. And we are still, even though we're trying to commemorate history, we are still surrounded by the realities of modern day life and modern day politics, where nowadays we're looking at a new context of all of these different histories and all the realities of these different histories, and how many of them are still impacting a lot of the communities even today, especially with Cliveden. Even though the American Revolution has I guess maybe little to none with the current modern day. You could, if you want to stretch some of the degrees, but we'll just go with that. The gun violence and things like that in Germantown, for them, it's tone deaf to the community because they're doing, firing off guns, whether they're blanks or not. It's not really the point here as to, the people that are suffering through gun violence. And it becomes part of like, who is the audience of Germantown then? Is it the community there, or is it the outside? And how does that look and portray to more broader perspective to not just Germantown but outside of this? Same thing with if you're doing a Civil War reenactment. Who are you portraying this to? Who is the audience? Who are you trying to bring in? The list kind of goes on and on. If there's a stigma that a lot of reenactments are kind of a mainly white only, if you will, types of events. Although I've seen plenty of people of color and things like that, people like that at reenactments, but it's always majority white. And there is kind of a callback as to what are we celebrating here? What are we trying to portray, and who's actually looking at this? That's kind of why maybe the stigma is why it's maybe a little bit missing the mark in some cases. And I'll wrap that up here, so I'm not talking for another 20 minutes or so.
You're good. And I might need to pop off a quick second here.
That's okay.
But before I do, you hit you hit on something really solid there, where it's humanizing without sympathizing, and that's a hard line. That is a very hard line to humanize without actively sympathizing for people in rough situations. And or more importantly, it perception is a huge issue. How do you help the public perceive that you don't sympathize, you're just trying to humanize? That's a real issue. And you mentioned also, right, like Americans want to see, the Continentals beat back the Redcoats, right? And when I used to reenact in Florida, we did an event where the Germans won at the end, and the crowd was infuriated, and kind of like understandably so, right? Like when we create these, when planners and site organizers plan these battles, they have to take the modern context into it, right? They have to. It's just a reality.
Yeah.
But yeah, like going back to the humanizing without sympathizing, when you get into the 20th century, things get really dicey. Hell, one of the reasons why was Spanish Civil War. That's a big one. I portray both nationalist rebels and republicanos factions, is because when I started building my nationalist kits, I had actual fascists coming to me being like, "Hey man, you down for the cause?" I'm like, "No." And then when I started building my Republican kits, I'd have people go, "Hey comrade, are you down for the global revolution?" I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm trying to help people who come to my encampment see the various sides, the materials, the propaganda, the booklets, the things they read, the songs they sang, the food they ate."
Right.
And help people understand, how could two brothers, right? Because again, Civil War, how could two brothers come to so dramatically different opinions on the situations around them? And how did they respond to it? And why did they respond the way they did? Yeah. And there are, at battle reenactments, real living historians who do that.
I mean, I know it's probably a whole lot of Red Army reenactors that are the complete opposite of what the Red Army stood for. So yeah.
I mean,
for the uninitiated, Soviet reenacting is kind of the redheaded stepchild of World War II reenacting.
Well, I mean, like I have impressions that have the communist red star on them, and my family, who survived the Cuban Revolution, had some very serious issues with me even wearing some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, right. there's always going to be limits.
I will be right back though.
Okay.
I do need to go fix something real quick.
That's all right. Yeah, no rush. But kind of going back on what you said about people of color and reenacting, it's definitely something that's not well enough advertised, that people, it's not just a bunch of old white dudes. And I kind of see that on one actually really touching thing I witnessed not long after the Charleston church shooting, which is just really hard for the whole community in Charleston, but particularly African American people, was that there was a Civil War living history that I helped portray one of the soldiers in. And at that living history at Morris Island, there was the 54th Massachusetts, who was an African American unit. And because the church shooting had just happened like 3 weeks earlier, they went and did a in-person, in-kit prayer service to commemorate those who were lost. But they did so from the vantage point of Union soldiers. And I just thought that was really touching. Unfortunately, I didn't get to make it to that final part, but I kind of heard about it after. And it just, to me, that was kind of a way that reenacting was used as an agent of healing. So I think it's like art. It's like a media. You can use it for,
oh yeah,
it
definitely.
can be tone deaf. It can be, but you're absolutely right about the
yeah. And I'm painting with broad brush strokes here. There's obviously, like I say in the beginning of all of this, it's just how you use it. You can use it for all sorts of things. Just that I think broadly in in the history of reenacting, it hasn't always been inclusive or anything like that. And I'm not saying that all reenactors and stuff like that are exclusionary or racist or anything like that. I think a very large majority of them are the complete opposite. Most of us are pretty okay with anyone as long as you're not a complete jerk or something.
Yeah, there's a subculture drama in every subculture, whether you're a
Yeah,
cosplayer, reenactor, Magic the
definitely.
Gathering player. But yeah, absolutely.
But I think it has something to do with, the stigma of, if we can just stick, I guess, with Civil War, since I think I'm a lot more familiar with uh, things like that. I would like to look up the data as to how many people that aren't white show up to Civil War reenactments and things like that. And I'm not bringing up the race thing just to bring up the race thing, but like rather, if we're supposed to bring this into a new modern era and really be a broader audience, it's like, well, who is, that audience? And I've gone to a lot of reenactments where it is, I'd say like 90% white. I've been to a couple others where it's been, a lot maybe more diverse. It really depends on also where you're doing. I've been in the middle of like nowhere, like really rural area, North Carolina, where, pretty much the entire population is going to be like 90% white or something like that, at least in certain parts. And it's like, well, okay, I guess that, kind of makes sense. But, when we think about it in public, display, especially as far as like media goes, that people then kind of like you with your professor, take it out of context and kind of spin it. And, Civil War already has such a bad, weirdly bad connotation with it because, the a small faction of people and they're kind of, I guess, spoil the whole bunch, so to speak. Same thing with, I'm pretty sure like we're touching with humanizing and things like that with, it's like, why would you want to do Wehrmacht, World War II reenacting? You're doing the bad guys. And, there's always a silly answer of like, well, someone's got to be the bad guy. But, there's no, there's a weird disconnect because I think pretty much most reenacting, like if you're doing 19th century and onwards, people sort of automatically assume that you almost identify with that ideology for some freaking reason. But I could put on a red coat even though I don't care for monarchies whatsoever, and it's just none the wiser. Oh, sorry, I can't offend Ben over here.
Especially
I'm
Albion.
gonna mute you now.
Perfidious Albion needs to be put in its place.
Well, I mean, and I get what you're saying. Like, I do like part of this may surprise people, but I'm actually a strong not anti-monarchist for the United States. I mean, Britain should keep their monarchy, but no, I'm happy with the result
Yeah.
of the revolution.
I mean,
but it's a shtick you put on. You're like, I'm a loyalist for His Majesty while I'm wearing a red coat.
It's kind of like, cosplaying a Imperial Stormtrooper from Star Wars. No one actually thinks you should worship Emperor Palpatine and stuff like that, but it's a cool uniform or whatever. But unfortunately, that stigma doesn't carry across to other things. And honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, it'd be really interesting how people maybe in the future with better technologies will reenact like Star Wars battles for whatever reason they might, and how that might come across. But they will.
I guarantee they will.
I hope I am alive to see that.
I hope I'm not, because frankly, I don't want fandoms to die. But that's just
look, man. I did stuff with Rebel Legion and 501st.
You've seen things, man.
No, I absolutely believe. See, the technology was there. They would absolutely blast each other with fake lasers. And again, it goes back to the very primal human fascination with and cool things, like cool uniforms and military martial vigor. Rah rah rah.
Well, if I can bring us back for 1 second, no, it's fine. I'd like to rant about how much I don't like Star Wars. I did give it an honest try watching it, but I couldn't get into it. Anyway,
it's okay, you can still be wrong.
Fine. But we're getting too far afield.
But yes. I want to bring up some of the criticisms of battle reenacting, because I know, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're all biased to some degree towards supporting battle reenacting. But some of the things I've seen, I'm not going to read full quotes just because I want to respect people's privacy, but there was a heated discussion on some living history circles on Facebook that I see the kitty, that basically the gist was the days of reenacting are over. This is great news. Now people can just go and enjoy living history presentations of candle dipping and military demonstrations without battle. And one of the things that someone said was there should be events where you have to be juried and like picked by or you have to kind of be well vetted to go. It seems to me that Mike, you had said something about the democratization of history. I thought was interesting. You want to get into that at all?
Yeah, so I'll jump on that. And don't get me wrong, right? Like for some museums and for some events, I totally get the jurying thing, right? Like museum curators have a very specific narrative that they want to portray. And for the sake of funding or for the sake of the message of the museum they want, they do need to stick to that. Also, también, when you have, also as well, when you have people speaking on behalf of the museum, you want to make sure that that person isn't spouting something like lost cause or mentality or, German Versailles Treaty, we were wronged propaganda, right? Like you want to make sure if they're speaking on a official museum capacity, especially something like Jamestown's marching through time, military through time event, you want to make sure that that person, as a museum runner, that person's vetted. When you're doing these larger battle reenactments, though, talking about the democratization of history, democratization of memory, one of the things that, okay, this cat is being, he's being fussy. One of the things that, when it's the democratization of history, that's both good and bad, right? Like it's bad in the sense that, right, like anyone has suddenly an opinion, they throw on some wool coat and the crowd member around them suddenly thinks they're an authority. That's why most respectable units I've met typically have one or two specific spokespeople, especially German reenacting units. They have a specific spokesperson who understands everything about the time period and can answer the harsh questions honestly. And that's a critical key, right? Like you need to answer the harsh questions honestly. Did your unit commit war crimes? Don't spout the clean Wehrmacht myth. Acknowledge that, yeah, the Wehrmacht committed X and Y crimes. Acknowledge that the Confederacy fought fundamentally for the preservation of slavery, right? Like you have to, when you're portraying these units, fundamentally understand everything around it. And you have to, if anything, find the one person who, if he or she is good at understanding all the cultural, political stuff, have them be the spokesperson that talks to the crowd. If you or you're a unit leader and you know some of your members maybe shouldn't talk, right? Like have a spokesperson and then have the rest of the members be for the battle. I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. What was?
Well, I brought that up. It was actually my fault that we went on a tangent because I brought up, you had talked to me previously about this idea.
Democratization. There we go.
Yeah, democratization.
Okay. Thank you. So we're back to that now. I'm not gonna lie. In this hobby, I've met humans who have done better work than some academic historians.
Oh yeah.
and I say that as an academic historian, risking my own job. But in all seriousness, right? Like I'll met people who didn't finish college, but when I asked them, hey man, like I need help with this 16th century timeline, I don't understand how I can relay this to my students. They'd be like, hey man, here's a bunch of wood carvings, here's some diaries I found. These are humans who, because of the passion and the love they have of this history, they've been able to dig up and find these primary sources, right? I've met World War II reenactors who they're not trained in any sort of oral history course, right? They're not trained in the theories or the methodologies of ethnography or whatever is in vogue with the weird child of history and poli-sci that is anthropology. Yet, because of their hobby, they've sat down with veterans of World War II and have had veterans admit things to them and talk to them and share stories that they haven't shared with their own families.
Right.
I have one friend of mine who, again, he got a bachelor's in forestry or something. I forget the exact thing he got it in. Yet, because of World War II reenacting, he was able to get a German veteran of Kursk for the first time to ever talk about his experience as a drafty Wehrmacht soldier on the front line.
Wow,
And he was able to record it.
that's insane.
All because of the hobby, right? And so the democratization of history, right? Like the more credentials you have, the farther you're removed you are from the people who did this, right? Like especially again, 18th century, right? Like both of y'all, Sean, Ben, most of the guys y'all portray couldn't read, right? Like let's get real here.
I still
right?
can't read, so I guess it works.
Or
I just memorize letters and what they mean at this point.
Right? Or like if they could read, right, they weren't what you'd call an educated gentleman or educated lady, right? Like the actually accredited educated humans are so far removed from the people we're trying to portray because sometimes we forget what it's like. And sometimes, you know what? Sometimes you need the guy who his day job is thatching houses, and he can get into the mindset of that human way better than you could.
What, you mean to tell me the average soldier wasn't a history PhD student in the 18th century?
Unless they were Blue Division, which Anthony Beaver, an accredited historian, has actually gone on the record saying that the Spanish Blue Division was the most educated military formation in history, but for the wrong side.
Yeah, for the wrong side. Well, I want to talk about some of the criticisms that I guess, and a lot of this is what I call circular firing squads. So this actually comes from people who are living historians. So like we said earlier, there's two groups of people. There's people who do reenacting, and then there's people who sometimes are in the museum studies field or academic who do kind of living history as not a profession, but as more academically focused. And a lot of their criticism is battle reenactments. There's a little bit of ageism thrown in there, like, oh, it's a bunch of boomers, and or it's a bunch of old white men firing blanks at each other in a spectacle. I mean, these are some of the critiques I've heard. What are some of the critiques that you guys have heard, and how would you respond to
them? I mean, so this kind of goes, I guess, kind of wraps back to your earlier point about, juried events, I'm paraphrasing here, no more battle events, hooray, moving on type of mentality. I think, coming from public history, I kind of understand where some of it comes from, because the joke is that a lot of battle reenactments at this point, and I don't know about all of them, but let's just say for Rev War and maybe some Civil War, most battle reenactments aren't reenacting the battles, they're reenacting the reenactments from beforehand. They're reenacting the bicentennial. And that's, I think, what most people are tired of, is that it hasn't moved on with more current research. They're still doing, the Clive Den has done the same thing for about like 40 years or however long the bicentennial's been. And I think that's mainly the heart of the issue. I don't think it's the battle reenacting itself. I think it's just that it hasn't caught up with the times, and that it's still kind of stuck in this rigid, quasi-romanticized past or something like that. It does stem, I think there is maybe like a generational thing of like, it's just a bunch of, people either recreating what the boomers did or whatever, 40 years ago or whatever, you want to say with that, or it's just, like I was saying earlier, maybe a little bit tone deaf or something like that. As to whether accurate portrayals, we're talking about juried events and things like that. And I think a lot of it just stems from, again, it just not keeping up with the times, and whether that is research wise or modern politics or what have you, and I kind of hate, saying that, we need to pay attention to this stuff. Is like, but this stuff kind of circulates, modern politics does affect other parts of our hobby and things like that, and our perceptions. I know a lot in my group, even though I consider myself more of a progressive living historian or whatever, I am in a mainstream group, and I like the group. I love, my guys and everything. Quite a few of them were in the bicentennial, from 1975, and have been in the hobby ever since. And Oh, Mike, you had a
Yeah,
question?
we should probably clarify what progressive and mainstream reenacting is
Yeah.
to progressive and mainstream politics. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's
And I don't mean that I'm
yeah.
a,
No,
progressive
no, no. So
politically.
let's
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, let's lay out the
So,
definition.
that
So progressive is all right. So there's three tiers of reenacting for those who are uninitiated. There's progressive
those
slash hard.
who wisely have not jumped into this
Yeah,
rabbit hole of a hobby.
who are probably better for not having done so. But there's at the top of the I guess if we're talking about like a pyramid, at the top of the pyramid is hardcore slash progressive. Progressive doesn't mean politically progressive. Actually, reenactors by large are more right leaning, just because it's older men who are military, so you kind of get that intersection. In the median area, you have what's called mainstream reenacting, which is where most of us fall. Which is you care about authenticity, but you're also, or you realize you're there for a good time as much as you are there for a historical time. So once the crowd leaves, you break down camp, you drink, and then you got what's called farbs, which are Ren Fair. I've been to a reenactment where furries showed up. I kid you not. I don't know how that got kosher.
I got a
So that's
story.
the three tiers of.
So
yeah.
okay, so let's. I kind of want to help refine. So progressive, it's not like progressive hardcore. It's like they are progressively improving, right? They are
Yeah.
progressively doing
It's a
research.
mindset. It's not
Yeah,
really.
it's we're always progressing on our kits, right? Finding the right blend of
Yeah. This is where you
fabric.
get the,
Wool and linen,
the
yeah.
stereotype of, stitch counters or whatever it
Yes,
is.
stitch
And a lot of that,
copies.
comes from a book called Confederates in the Attic from the 90s.
And then you have mainstream reenactors, which if you've seen Sweet Home Alabama, that's mainstream. Really, it's very much like, all right, it's your average Joe and Jane wanting to dress up in some historical dress, and then there's farbs, which farb is more of a mindset because everyone starts not being 1000% locked on, but a farb is it's good enough, and they'll wear the same thing, or it's not so much wearing clothing. Farb is a mindset of like, oh, I heard this member of my unit spout this historical fact, so I'm going to take that as gospel in spite of having never done my own research.
Sure.
And that's most of the criticism of reenacting comes from that mentality, right? It comes from the mentality that, oh, guys and girls before me said that historical fact, so I like them. They're my buddy. I drink with them. I'm going to repeat that fact, even though it's 20 years later and historical documentation has proven that dead wrong, right? That's a fundamental issue. Going back to your point earlier of like, Sean, your point earlier of like recreating past, I remember trying to join an artillery unit and they asked me, oh, would you like a unit history? I was like, yeah, I'd love to learn more about like what this unit did during this war. I'm trying to be as vague as possible because I would still like to run with them. But they sent me a unit history and it was a whole like 5-page text document explaining how this unit got founded in the 90s and all of the shenanigans they've gotten into, which, okay, bro, that's cool for like learning about you. Like, I could have just done that by going to an event and having a drink with you. I didn't need a 5-page text document, but I wanted to learn about, the actual dudes
Right.
that fought in this battle, right? Like, that's what I wanted to learn about. And that mentality, it's hard to separate.
Yeah.
Because it's human nature too, right? Like we want to identify with our people, with our tribe.
Yeah. Well,
That's what.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, continue. I was done.
Oh, well, I was going to say, and that kind of boils down to the downsides of going off what you said earlier, Mike, about the democratization of history. Because when you get people who are more concerned with the actual reenacting, like y'all both have said, you're reenacting the reenactment, and then where personal pet peeve when you get people who do that who call themselves historians, but I won't go on that tangent too much because it'll make me sound like I'm gatekeeping the word historian. Maybe because I'm just been in grad school a little while. Don't want to get too arrogant, but look at me being all arrogant. But
you ivory tower elitist.
Ivory tower.
How dare you
fire my catapult at you? But I mean, jokes aside, like that, like there is an element where that can be like you can get people who are not doing enough historical research, like you said, who are then calling themselves historians, and they're representing historical sites, and that can create all kinds of drama. And going back to your earlier point, Sean, of being tone deaf, I think a lot of that comes from that lack of standards from units for historicity, and that's a legitimate criticism that
Yeah.
more progressive or living historian circles have. But my bigger worry is that some really crappy reenactments or crappy tendencies that y'all have pointed out are then being said, oh, see, that's proof that battle reenactments are now out of date. What do y'all think about that?
I don't this is weirdly out of character because I'm usually much more cynical, but I'm a little bit more optimistic in this case. I don't think it means the end of battle reenactments, and maybe the end of battle reenactments as in some cases as far as we know. But I mean, this is also one instance, this isn't this isn't the whole, like, it's one little, not exception, but like one thing out of many different events going on. And there's been plenty of um, fairly well researched, well done, well organized battle reenactments and things like that happening, across, let's just say, the continent. I don't know how it is on the other side of the pond or anything, but so I think there is quite a bit of good proof. I think it's just there's going to be a lot more verification with not just the reenactors, but the local communities and things like that, as to well as like, hey, can we put this here smack dab? Like, there's a lot of modern battlefields that are now, underneath suburbs, towns, lakes, even some cases. It's like, are we commemorating the stuff that happened here? Are we commemorating just the event in general? If we're doing that, how are we going to do that? But I know that a lot of the people that are going like, oh, thank goodness, probably, I think maybe meant a lot of them aren't doing it as like, oh, we don't want any more people, firing a musket ever, but rather just maybe we need to find other things to focus on other than battle reenactments. There's other stuff you can do other than lining a bunch of men or having a bunch of men run around on a field firing blanks at each other. I mean, if you think about it, a soldier probably only sees at least in the early modern warfare, I can attest to more modern warfare, really few times in a year, depending on what regiment you are. So most of the other days of the year, they're doing garrison duty, camp life, taking a leak by a tree or something like that.
Well, let's not reenact that too much.
Yeah, well, I think many of us probably do that at night.
Not in front of the public.
Yes,
not in front of the public.
Yeah, not in public.
I mean, the porta-johns are not always clean, so.
And that's kind of the, that kind of brings out, especially with like porta-johns, it's like it's still taking place in a modern sphere. Like we have to take into account that a lot of these modern fields, you take pictures and you sometimes see these reenactors, posed in front of like the historic field, and it looks really nice in the foreground. But when you look in the background, there's like a, Toyota Tacoma and a, a plane flying in the background, or a skyscraper or something like that. And you're like, it's not quite the same picture. But I'm always, not for throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's just like, yeah, it's in a modern sphere. We're not actually recreating this thing. We're just kind of doing a memorial commemoration, but it's really just kind of, what else can we do? It's like, okay, Cliveden has decided not to do the reenactment of Germantown. It's like, well, they can either do it somewhere else, and they can find other things to do to commemorate Germantown. Like they can have camps or something like that of the two sides talking about, yeah, here's what we represent, here's what happened or something, without actually firing a shot. I've been to plenty of reenactments and events where I never fired maybe but more than just doing the musket demonstration, and had a complete blast. Pardon the pun. No, not pardon the pun. I intend my puns. I am not a coward.
And the podcast name is Cannon Blast.
So. Exactly. So I think there's plenty of room. I think it's just maybe a coming to a head of, hey, there's more to living history and reenacting than battle reenactments and things like that. And I think that's kind of the heart of the matter of it, is that not everything. And I know we're circling back to what we started, but I really think that's probably what's the whole point of this dang thing in the first place, is that there's more to it than just firing blanks at each other and things like that.
Well, absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
But as you said, man, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like just because battle reenactment shouldn't be the focus doesn't mean that they aren't a big draw.
Oh, and I'm not saying that
yeah.
they should be done. I love battle reenactments in
Right,
the first
so
place. I'm just saying that there's other stuff.
There is other stuff. So like I want to give an example. When I was in Florida, there's a railroad museum in Parrish, Florida, where they would do a reenactment that if I had to describe it, and if every participant had to describe it, it was a combination of Hogan's Heroes and Trains.
Wait, was I there with you?
I don't think you were there. I don't know.
No, this was the one in Jacksonville. Yeah.
Yeah, but in Parrish, Florida, there's a railroad museum, and they do a whole World War II, basically dinner theater, right? Where like a train goes in, and like it's a whole made-up story of like American troops capturing the German train and capturing German. Not the point, right? Like silliness and story-wise aside, right? And spectacle of grown men playing army and launching cap guns at one another. This event drags in so many people through the gates of this museum that it pays half of the museum's entire annual budget in a weekend.
Yeah.
In a weekend.
And I can.
And that's what the point I'm trying to make here is, right? Like these battle reenactments, yeah, we can sit here and agree with the naysayers, right? Because they make good points, right? Like if they didn't make good points, we wouldn't be having this podcast. Like let's start with that.
Well, I'm always fishing for content, so I don't know.
And Ben, you love content.
Let's go create problems so I can have more podcast episodes.
But no, in all seriousness, right? Like these battle reenactments are a public draw.
Mm-hmm.
And so long as it can be mixed with thoughtful living historians, right? They're incredible resources for especially smaller museums, right? Like big areas like Williamsburg and Jamestown that have these massive endowments with corporate funding. I'm probably over exaggerating. I know they're always asking for more.
Yeah, Williamsburg's hurting for cash, so it's less optimistic than you think.
I know, and I get that. And don't get me wrong, I love the Williamsburg and Jamestown people. They're fantastic humans. I love the Jamestown folks whenever they'd come down to Drake's Raid in St. Augustine, and they'd always shoot me because I was on the Spanish side. But the fact is for smaller museums, smaller military museums, smaller whatever cow towns and etc. right? Like especially like in the Midwest, right? There's like little cow towns all over the place where they're having these battle reenactments is the only thing that keeps them financially solvable.
Yeah.
Well, that's true if you look at Conneaut, Ohio. I had never heard of. Well, first off, I had never traveled to Ohio.
Ohio doesn't exist.
Ohio doesn't exist. There's a long inside joke with that I won't get into. For my Ohio listeners, I love you. But the Conneaut, Ohio is this little town on Lake Erie. It's a podunk town. It's cute. It's a cute town. Like to go there. But the only source of income for that town is their annual D-Day reenactment. And I was part of it about 4 years ago. And one of the biggest groups of people there were World War II and Korean veterans. I mean, I say biggest people, it's probably about 100 of them. And they loved it. Like I would think that if I had gone through World War II or Korea, that I would be horrified by people pretending to emulate. But no, like they came up to us after and like, wow, thanks for doing this. And of course, we said, no, thank you for your service. But they actually thought we were honoring their memory. Now, I know not all veterans feel that way, but there was a sense of, I got kind of teary for lack of, not to be too cheesy, but I got like kind of choked up because like this 90-something-year-old World War II veteran is like, oh, thank you guys for being here. And it's like, wow, I made this guy's day who, put himself on the line. And that made me as a reenactor feel like I wasn't just there for a Wild West shoot 'em up. And not all of them are going to be like that. I mean, you're not going to resurrect dead redcoats, at least I hope not, to come watch a Revolutionary War reenactment. But I mean, I think it does speak to the fact that there is public utility for military style engagements. But as y'all have said, there's ways to communicate better with the public, to be less tone deaf. And I had to help organize a living history for the College of Charleston about 2 years ago. I think I invited y'all, but you didn't come. I don't know about you, Sean, but I know I invited you, Mike.
I didn't like you then.
You didn't like me then? Okay, well
I was in Kansas.
You're not an
Still in
excuse.
Kansas, by the
But
way.
I helped organize it, and then the point I'm getting to is they are doing the 250th anniversary of the college. They are wanting to do some programming, and they came to me because I was an adjunct at the time and said, "Hey, you do reenacting? Do you want to do a living history program?" And there was some opposition to it, understandably, because some of the people thought we were coming as Confederates or Civil War soldiers, and we had to explain, no, 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 we're doing a Revolutionary War, 18th century, pre-American Civil War program that shows both sides, civilian, soldier, British, and American. And when we communicated that clearly, people were more receptive. And I think it was you, Sean, that pointed out earlier, we just don't communicate as well as we should with the public. We shoot at each other and go home. I mean, it's
Hey, before you start, Sean, Ben, you remind me some, again, a lot of these veterans, especially with World War II, I know, again, 18th century guys, y'all ain't gonna have this.
we have to have a seance to bring those ones back. Yeah, we
Right?
do.
Or they're a vampire like Keanu Reeves.
What are you talking about? I talked to Thomas Jefferson the other day.
You may want to get some psychiatric evaluation.
With the World War II veterans, I mean, the most impactful moment I've had, just as a living historian, was when I went to so the Commemorative Air Force does an event in Peachtree, Georgia every year, where it's like a big hangar dance, this small airport, and it generates most of the money they need to be able to maintain these 80-plus-year-old airplanes, right? Like, so that's impressive in its own right. But I remember while I was there, I'm just walking around, and this World War II veteran is just staring at me. I mean, he is just like not taking his eyes off me the entire time. And the battery act goes down, and afterwards, I'm, we're walking up, and I'm walking by. I'm saying, "Hey, sir, like, thank you guys for coming out. Like, I know it was, especially this dude this man by this point, like in his 90s. So it's hard to come out to these public events that they're invited to." And as I'm shaking his hand, thank you, he's like, "Hey, hold on," and he grabs his friend. They've been part of the same unit of the 82nd, and he points and he goes, "Doesn't he look like," I forget the name of the young man, he said. But his friend agreed that evidently I looked a lot like a friend of theirs. And for the next 30 minutes, we sat there talking about the experiences that they had with this young man. They never told me what happened to the young man. I didn't ask, because at that point, by the look in their eyes near the end of the conversation, you can kind of pick up what happened to this young man. But what this fun, going back to the democratization of history, what these public battles allow is for, especially those who went through it, right? Like a chance to not just, I know it's traumatic to go through it, but like when they reconnect, oftentimes, and I've seen this I've read multiple cases of this. This is purely anecdotal. If you want to go statistical analysis, like some of my colleagues do, you're probably going to be disappointed. But they then go home and actually tell their stories to their sons or daughters. Or, their daughter took them to the reenactment, right? And after everything, they had just these impactful conversations that this old man never had his entire life, because he didn't think his daughter or son would understand. And after they'd seen a glimpse, right? Like a dumb, silly glimpse, they at least open up. There's a beauty to that. There's an importance to that. And that's why I think battle reenactment shouldn't be thrown out. I get why, like, again, I've fallen guilty to calling Civil War silly war, because that's some Civil War reenactments, right? It's a whole carnival atmosphere with funnel cake and garbage.
And dysentery.
Right?
And dysentery.
Love that comic. But I know Ben doesn't, but I love that comic.
He copied my critique of it and got all of his followers to like angry react to my post.
Well, because your critique was pretty. Whatever. Moving on. Moving on.
I didn't hold back at all.
In all seriousness, right? Like, even with again the carnival like atmosphere and some of these things, like all that, it allows for at least enough important conversation to happen amongst families, right? Like when they're driving home and the mom asks their child, "Hey, how did you like it?" Right? And the child asks questions that are out of the blue, it at least forces that family to engage something, while also simultaneously helping the sites that these events took part in gain the revenue they need to run the rest of the year. Because let's get real, money doesn't grow on trees, and we are a market economy, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're not just going to get cash thrown at you because some dudes shot at one another there 100 years ago. Congratulations, right? No. Like, you have to continually make yourself marketable.
And I think on that point too, there is a liability with reenactors. Like, if you look back at the National Park Service's history, yeah, there is cases where cannons firing can destroy earthworks, but I think that there has been an unnecessary barrage against reenactors as a whole because of the bad behavior of a few. And you're right, like, there is some of these sites like Gettysburg, like, of course, I think Gettysburg's such a big event in American history, people are going to go there regardless, but the Battle of Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, where I grew up, nobody in their right mind is going to go to Mississippi if they have to, first off. Second off, no one would know where this podunk town was unless there was this shootout reenactment that I used to go to in the 90s. And it was funny. And it taught me about myself because my dad is from Manhattan. My mom is from Mississippi. So they would both be rooting for opposite sides of the reenactment. And I didn't understand North and South till I started going to that reenactment. And it kind of taught me a little bit. I mean, it was probably more festive than it should have been. And we weren't at the point in our country where we're looking at the Civil War more critically. But I mean, there was an element of like, wow, North and South are both American. They're both shooting at each other. And 6-year-old me was like, why is that going on? And my parents did use that as a teaching moment. And I attribute that reenactment, as goofy as it was, to part of my childhood interest in reenacting and history.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of teaching methods that you can get from these battle reenactments and everything. To go back to an earlier point, and I'm going to sound a little bit like a devil's advocate, and I trust you, I'm not, but I am going to sound
we
like
need
one.
that. That's fine.
You know, these reenactments are good revenue. I mean, for my site, except for one or two of our other fundraisers, our biggest fundraiser was our Celtic themed, you know, St. Patrick's Day festival. So like that was our biggest, you know, draw for the most part, but we do get a lot of revenue from the battle reenactments. You know, our main bread and butter was school programs, but the you know, the nice cherries on top, so to speak, were the battle reenactments that brought in revenue. You know, that's always nice. I think the drawbacks though is that it maybe sometimes overemphasizes the importance of battles. I mean, and this is just anecdotal, so just take it with you will. You know, I've had quite a number of visitors have come out and go like, so what battles were fought here? You know, asking me to basically sell the site, you know, for them to buy the ticket to go in and visit. And it's like, this is a historic plantation. Like that's what our main draw is. And you know, it's like, well, there was a battle like down the road, two different ones actually, Cowan's Ford or McIntyre's skirmish, but none on the actual site. You know, and it brought me to questions like, do we only value history if people like shot each other and died, or if there was a battle somewhere? And you know, and that's a whole topic for another discussion. Obviously, we'll be here till like we can burn midnight oil on that one. Yeah. But the other thing is like, you know, you go to a reenactment, and you know, if you're working as someone that's actually worked a reenactment as a staff event, whatever, you know, oftentimes the question is like, when's the reenactment? You know, it's never about any of the other listed stuff on the event, you know, that are just, I think, as cool as, you know, as the actual battle skirmish scenario. But it's always, when's the battle take place? You know, we won't get to the cross that you can just easily read the schedule, you know, using your eyeballs. But you know, it's always, when is
the battle happening, and really the other events are just to hold them over until 1 o'clock or whatever time it is happens. People firing at each other, you get the hot sweaty reenactors back in camp, people come over and maybe pester you with questions. Doesn't happen too much with us redcoats. They don't like us very much, but
nor should they. Perfidious Albion. Anyway.
yeah. So what happens is then, coming from that, there is a little bit of a distaste. And I'm not saying I hate it. It's just that, like, working them a couple of times for a number of years, you go like, oh my God, like this, this again, or what have you. And, there's always been the case of like, I'd rather do other things that do the same type of nature of provocative thinking and, stuff like that. But it's also just kind of, and this might digress a little bit off the tracks, but, what types of battles do you commemorate on the site? If you're a historic site from the Civil War or American Revolution, or just a generic time period around that scale, you can get away with a lot of things. But I know my site caught a lot of flack with a lot of World War II reenactors because we stopped doing World War II events. And, oddly, it wasn't out of like, we just did not like, World War II events or anything. And as far as what I know is that mainly just, it just did not fit with the main interpretation of the site. It's like we were a early 1800s cotton plantation. We can get, by with doing Rev War battle reenactments. We can sometimes get by with Civil War stuff, although I think we're mainly doing more Civil War, just living history rather than a strict battle reenactment. But the World War II stuff, it's like the public isn't dumb, but they're very impressionable. So people get the wrong, like, oh, this is what a World War II battle looked like, and you're looking at an early federal era farm. So it's kind of like, what point are you trying to get across with these types of events? What are you trying to get across with? What are you portraying on this site specifically? And I know that's really hard to do, as on the North American continent, trying to do more modern warfare, because obviously there hasn't been a battle here since the Civil War, or, in most cases here. You can talk about other parts, maybe like if you're on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska somehow, it's like, yeah, we had Japanese
or Blair Mountain.
Yeah, anyway. Blair Mountain. Yeah,
I would love to go to like Atu Island and do a living history there. That'd be fun.
I'm talking more just like the non like obscure kinds of events or what have you.
And that reminds me of the Georgia State Parks had a Viking reenactment at Fort King George a few years ago, and I had some friends do it. And the fort had to put up a big disclaimer, and Vikings never made it this far south.
Yeah.
Or hell, I mean, I'm looking at doing right now, right? Like with my Balearic Island Slinger. I highly doubt the Roman Empire set foot on the North American continent.
That we know of, right? You can't disprove it yet.
But there's an event going on in Missouri, where in Missouri, these historical enthusiasts recreated a Viking market, even though there is no evidence of Vikings being in Missouri. But again, right? Like it's people still we could open a whole can of worms here, but like people kind of want to have a connection with their history. And if you look at the United States, you mentioned this earlier, Sean, a good chunk of the humans in the United States have European ancestry of various stripes.
No, yeah. And I want to, point out is like, I don't disagree with doing Viking or Roman. I might, honestly, I still look at it and go, but I still kind of like it because I'm like, ooh, La Corica, ooh, armor, stuff like that. It's all cool, but I don't. Yeah. It's just a qualm of like, have a what do you call, like a boilerplate going like, hey, there were no actual Roman battles fought here or anything, but this is a part of history. This is part of our, a legacy, if you will, as Americans or something.
Talking about the public, I mean, just real quick, talking about, they're not dumb, but they're impressionable. I remember there was one time where I was doing a guest lecture when I was getting my master's at a university, and I go in my American World War I officer's uniform. So it's got, the high collar, the tall boots, but it obviously says US on the collar, right? Like it's kind of hard to miss what country an American is fighting for in a World War I uniform. And I remember going up the elevator to the classroom, and there was a girl like in fear staring at me. And she asked me after I said hello to her, she's like, excuse me, why are you dressed like a Nazi?
I mean,
And
Ben and I can't say much. We went through
Oh,
Charleston dressed in red coats, and they were like calling us Confederates. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so-
and we were not the nicest to those people though. So we were
and
like,
you shouldn't be. At a
we were
certain
like, we're not
point-
Confederates. We're World War II. We are World War II Green Beret pirate privateers or something. And they bought it. They absolutely bought it.
well, they were also
okay,
very
hey,
drunk.
yeah,
So
time out.
let's-
Like
they were
like,
very
when I-
drunk.
We kind of had to play along.
when I'm in St. Augustine, right? Like I mess with drunk people all the time too. But
You have to.
But I'm getting at the point, right? Like again, I was doing a lecture at a university, and a university student thought I was dressed like a Nazi.
Well, at least you got the right century though. So like we've had Rev War. Like I was working a museum in Charleston for many years, and I would dress as Continental Soldier, Revolutionary War. And I had this guy very angrily come up and said, "Why are you dressed as a Confederate? The war is over. The North won." I'm like, "Sir, I'm dressed as a 18th century," and he was still wouldn't buy it. He's like, "I don't buy it," and walked off. And like he was very angry. Like he was looking for. You're never gonna. I think those people make up the minority of the
Yeah,
crowds you
and-
have. I think like Sean said earlier, most people are fairly certain of where World War II happened, and it didn't happen here. And
we could talk about dumb public stories all night. So let's top that off here before we get
Is
further
that
into
real
this.
fire?
Yeah.
is that a real baby?
That is the real controversy, is how do we handle dumb public questions. That should be a video for maybe another time. I
That
think
should
that's
be
the whole.
well, and you're gonna get that no matter what
Yeah.
side of the public you work with,
Yeah.
whether it's retail or I mean, my partner works in retail and gets all kinds of interesting
Yeah.
questions. But kind of going back to maybe wrap up a little bit. So the critiques are reenacting is tone deaf, outdated, maybe focuses too much on the battle, and y'all's responses have, and correct me if I'm wrong, been to the effect of, well, some of that's true, but there can be ways it can be addressed that are more time appropriate and also keep the light of battle reenacting alive.
It's more like there are responses, well, yes, but actually no. I mean, like that's that's
like most
kind
things, yeah.
That's pretty much, and really, just to, if I can steal the mod hat, is really, we can go, agree, disagree with a lot of the critiques, and I think for the most part we understand where it's coming from, but I think we can, get all esoteric all night as long as we want, but maybe on a lasting note is like, how do we just start improving this? How do we make it more constructive? We certainly have that emotive standpoint, like you were saying, Mike, from reaching out to still living veterans, from wars. We're teaching, getting kids that inner spark of being interested in history and things like that. I mean, I've seen that firsthand with doing programs and things like that, where children are like, oh my god, this is fun to like see people march around and things like that. But it's like, where do we, maybe if there is maybe a problem and we've kind of addressed it, it's kind of like, well, what do we do? I mean, what do we do to improve just at least maybe the battle reenactment part of it or something?
Sean, you also made an interesting point, and I think it ties back to Ben's. Notice, Ben, most of the criticism for this event came from effectively professionals.
Yeah.
Right. It was, as you point out, Sean, right? Like when you're working at a site and you have to do this hokey thing for the 1000th damn time. Right? Like, okay, I'm done, man. So for professionals, right? Like when they see that, it's aggravating.
It is, yeah.
But going back to the democratization point, for the overwhelming majority of the participants, these are your everyday folks, your plumbers, your school teachers, your electricians, your line repairmen,
your history grad students.
No, I'm being serious here.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
Like your lawyer, who for most days out of the week has to sit in an office reading cases, right? Like these are your everyday folks who just want for a weekend to connect with the past in any sort of way. And for professionals who deal with it on the daily, it might get tiresome dealing with some of the same cliches that they bring up and all that. But these people, they're finally, they're grappling with their past for a real moment in their history, while at the same time, ideally, making money for the site they're at, right? So that's kind of why I don't, as much as I love to make fun of the funnel cakes, as much as I love to make fun of, the portly humans wearing uniforms that I could use as a tent, at the very least, they're trying to connect with the past kinesthetically, right? Like I used to teach middle school, and when I was in my education courses, we had there's audio learning, visual learning, and kinesthetic learning, where it's through physical action that human learns something that they would have never grasped just by reading a book or just by looking at pictures or movies, right? Or video.
Sure.
And that is an act of a democratic kinesthetic learning for a large number of humans who are connecting with their past as imperfectly as they are.
Yeah.
At some time in their life. And that to me is the only reason we should keep this stuff around. Also, well, sorry, not the only reason. I like
it's a big reason.
I love gunpowder, man. Like
I like firing boomsticks and whatever you call them, right? It's a I think though it's a double sword with a democratization of it, because a lot of times, and I don't know how it is for every event and all these states and things like that, but I know a lot of sites host events, but really the showrunners are all oftentimes like volunteers within the groups. Like the battles are not usually planned by these sites. They're usually planned by, a volunteer reenactor or whatever. And, with certain battle reenactment festivity stuff happening, at least here in the southern states, won't name specific ones, the showrunners aren't exactly, how do I put this lightly, accurate in depicting pitched battles or something like that, and it ends up looking like your typical Farb Fest or something like that, with a bunch of the overweight guys firing 20 yards away, and things like that. And at that point it's like, well, who's running it then? It's like, how do we make sure that people running it are also going to be verified? And it's like, do we get actual historians, or do we get just regular people that maybe know stuff? And oftentimes it's I think a lot of the problem is that, at least down here, like I said, I don't know about anywhere else, so I'm not going to speak for North, Midwest, or some other countries, that a lot of the oftentimes for the mainstream events, especially, the showrunners are usually people that have good ties with the some person, or they've been doing it for 40 years, and that's just been their shtick for so long that's just been like, we just might as well not change anything.
Well, there definitely is a way of being set in your ways with reenacting. As somebody who's organized reenactment and who never plans to again, it's a lot of labor that you don't get a lot of thanks or money for. Like the site usually is the only one that the reenactors are doing this all. Usually, there's a couple exceptions, but 99% of the time are doing this out of their own very strained pocketbooks. And with me, my entire thing is, it's like I see the criticisms of the excesses of reenacting. But my solution would be to have a battle reenactment that also, as you kind of pointed out earlier, emphasize just as much the civilian and the like. I would love to give
or just garrison life,
or a demonstration of how to write with a quill. But I've noticed at reenactments, I don't even have time to sit down and do living history with people, because everyone's hyping up for the battle. Like, you got to do drill at 11:30, at 12:30 we're going to march to the battle, at 1:30 we're going to do this, at 2:30 we're going to clean muskets, blah blah blah. And while that's accurate for military life, there needs to be more room for reenactors to unwind and like interact with the public. That's I guess would be my long-term solution, other than also communicating publicly, like with disclaimers like, hey, this is a Civil War event. We do not identify with the causes that were fought with other than abolition, because you should identify with that. Or if you're doing a
none of
World
it,
War
none of
II, like an
None of it,
asterisk,
nope.
this World War II event is put on by living historians. Nobody taking part is doing so for political. Like, I think there could be more public messaging on that, because I think that gets in a lot of. But that's my two solutions. What would y'all solutions be to just kind of, as we probably have to wrap up here in a second?
Mike looked like he was going to explode a second ago.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry. I wasn't trying to.
You had
No,
you
no,
look like you
no.
had a question.
I mean, okay, so I guess I'll help her wrap up. I guess the one way really I could see a fix of this is vetting of primary organizers, right? So like, again, especially a lot of smaller, more local museums don't really have the resources to rely heavily on any sort of endowment or any of that. So you got to vet your organizers, because at that point, then you have to trust in the organizer will bring the right groups and the right humans. Plan the event you have, right? Ben, what you were talking about with that, the thing you were talking about of like, oh, drill and all that, that's more related to like, you know, some reenactors organize it to units, and then those units want to have some sort of drill thing to make sure all their people are on lock.
Yeah, that makes
because-
sense, but that should be done
Well,
before the
because
reenactment, in my opinion.
Yeah, but they don't go on like training weekends. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a whole other conversation.
They need to.
We don't have time to do.
But like when you're at the event, there should be the battle, and everything else should be other things. And that's I was kind of jumping off Sean's point earlier about like, why is the battle the premier event? Why is it not one of 5
because
premier
people
events?
like explosions.
People like exploring. We can train people to like other things.
It's the
too,
Michael Bay of festivities.
Yes, but I pointed to it in the beginning, right? Like, Hanum et Sitkus, right? Like, if we want to talk about what's the oldest reenactment, bro, oldest reenactment is the dudes in the Colosseum flooding it because they wanted to reenact the Battle of Actium.
And you're right, the oldest reenactments do go back to that period. But I guess my point was not so much that isn't the biggest draw for the crowd. It's that we should allow time for reenactors to do other things. I think the way reenactments are structured now, you get Friday, you set up camp and get shit-faced. Oh, I broke my own rule of no profanity. At this point, we're
Clap for yourself.
Saturday, you get up at 9 in the morning. You drill.
9. Jeez, it's late.
That's late. Okay, 7 sometimes, depends on the event. Then you go and everything's about the battle. And when the battle is over, it's like the momentum of the event. Your time with the public is over. Now you can kind of go dawdle and get ready for the ball or the drink fest or if it's another event like the Guy Fawkes Day. And then Sunday, it's a repeat of the same, and then everyone goes home. Everything is this nucleus is the battle, as opposed to just being one of 5 or 6 different heavily suggested. And I guess Sean kind of gave me that idea, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like the battle is too central, and I can kind of see it being part of rather than the nucleus of. And the crowd can still like it, but also don't put the pressure on reenactors and on the crowd to make that their. Be here by 1 so you can see the battle. Be here by 9 so you can meet with everybody and then see the battle.
Ben, but that goes back to the centrality of the organizers.
Right.
Yeah. So like what we're dealing with the organizers, I've been to events where what they'll do throughout the day is like they'll have like a fashion show of that time period. Or they will highlight specific encampments, right? Like, hey, go to this encampment at this hour and they're going to portray a blacksmithing display of that time period. Or hey, go to this sector of our village because at that time we're going to have a small show, right? The centrality of the organization is key. Reenactors are an incredible resource if you have humans who are capable of herding cats. So no, I'm not throwing shade at you, Ben. No, not at all. No, but in all seriousness, you need to have organizers who can give significant leeway and time for these other events so that they can all interlock and seem well.
Right.
And once you have organizers who can do stuff well, all the problems we've discussed throughout this entire, how long has it been now? Like an hour plus?
Yeah.
This has been long. Anyway, so long as you can have an organizer who can put everything can make all the pieces dance, it will mitigate 90% of the problems we've discussed.
And that makes
the other
absolute
10,
sense.
the other 10, it's, hey man, don't drink so much. We have people in front of us, right? Like that's the other 10. But
that's most people are pretty good about behaving in front of the public. I've only seen a few exceptions to that. So Mike's suggestion is to focus more on the organizers themselves. Sean, what would you say your suggestions to improve the structure of reenactments are?
I mean, I would completely agree with Mike here. You know, organizers, maybe to add something. It's I think maybe this is a little bit of a moment to do some natal, like, inward looking at ourselves as far as the hobby goes. Like, what are we doing this for? What are we wanting to portray? You know, how do we get across this to multitudes of different people in different communities and things like that? And you know, for you know, especially if you are, you know, your local communities, about, you know, what's the response. And you know, in this case with Cliveden, they did so. They made the you know, okay, you know, it's not the most beloved decision, but I think it's the best one that fit their situation with everything going on. But you know, it's all community. You know, like Mike said, you know, focus on event organizers, get stuff, you know, focus on, use the battle more as like a supporting, you know, archstone basically of everything, rather than it being the entire focus. You know, you can use it as the crescendo moment or whatever, you know, before everything kind of cascades back down towards the end of the day. You know, you just use it as a support rather than the complete focus. That way it's not like people wait around 3 hours for 1 o'clock to hit to see a bunch of sweaty dudes on the field, to fire at each other or bang at each other with swords and spears and shields or whatever it is. And then after that, it's like, okay, we're done. It's like, hey, we got other stuff, you know, going on. Just, I think basically it all boils down to, let's keep them, just do them gooder.
Doing gooder, yeah.
Yes.
And I think kind of what you said about tailoring the event. So like if I do the Battle of Camden or the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina, most people in the upper part of the state are okay with guns. They're fond of big explosions. It's a typically libertarian part of the South. I'm not going to worry as much. I mean, y'all know what I'm talking about. You're not going to worry as much about having the public perception. But if you're having a battle reenactment in an inner city area that's
I mean, imagine trying to do like Harlem, you know, the Battle of Harlem Heights in middle of New York City right now. I mean, that would never,
it would be tone deaf. And you
yeah.
want to tailor your events to the community, and you want to have community input. You don't want to make like, I've been at events where you know, it's not even just about urban areas. Like I was at the Fort Sumter 150th in 2011 in a very wealthy area of town. And the Confederates who were firing on Fort Sumter did so without telling the local town council. And a very large group of angry soccer moms were upset that cannons were firing at 7. And a couple Maseratis pulled up. This is Mount Pleasant. Mike can attest to this. This is Mount Pleasant in Charleston. A couple Maseratis pull up, and these very angry ladies were not happy that there was cannons being fired, and they wanted to speak to the manager of the reenactment. Dude, so I mean, there needs to be, but like I joke, but honestly, we should have been better at communicating with him.
Hold up, but we can have a whole conversation of like urbanization. I mean, in St. Augustine, which again, I love that town, and if I could live there, I would. But in St. Augustine, there's been this whole urban development area around the Castillo San Marcos, and they do a cannon firing every day, 4 to 5 times a day since the 70s.
Yeah.
And now, because there's like across the bay, there's more upscale housing, there's been more and more political complaints about the cannon firing that's been going on for 40 years.
And you got to take that into consideration because those are the taxpayers. Yeah.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Not related to this video.
But it does tie in, like, just tailoring and involving the community more. Because I mean, one of my biggest mistakes when I organized a reenactment on Johns Island is I didn't get Johns Islanders involved. I should have gotten more locals to tell me what could have drawn more of their folks and their family into the. We had 20 people in the audience. I had 100 reenactors and 20 spectators because I was so concerned with reenactor turnout, right? And if I could do it all over again, which God knows I wouldn't, you couldn't pay me to do reenactment organizing again. I love being a lowly private that doesn't have to do anything. I would first go to the community and
There's
say,
virtue
hey,
in that.
I want to recreate your ancestors' battle here. What can I do to interest you to bring you out here? And then go to reenactors and say, okay, this town wants A, B, and Z, and D. If I could do it all over again.
Well, Ben, that also ties into, and just to wrap this up, I'm doing working with local museums rather than working with local sites. That's
Right.
So for example, I mean, like I know at the 150th Battle of Chickamauga, which I went to, it was done on private property. And a lot of, especially Civil War battles, aren't done on the national sites because, you know, they don't want pollution at them because they're still active archaeological sites.
Yeah.
They're done on private sites, and the only way for those private sites to really, the only way for that to work is you have to work with local museums, local agencies, all that. Again, I don't want to keep throwing this at organizers because I know their work is hard enough, but
I think then, yeah.
prior planning, right? Like as I was taught in undergrad, right? In undergrad, prior planning prevents piss poor performance, right?
Absolutely.
Like, that is key.
Yeah. And I think maybe if, you know, if we are, and we will wrap this up as we've been saying for about 10, 15 minutes now.
It's a Cuban goodbye.
Exactly.
That's how it works.
Cuban
Exactly.
goodbye.
So maybe I guess it's like not pin it all on the event organizers. They can be the foundation of everything, but maybe, you know, us living historians need to take that charge then of making sure that like, hey, you know, I want to help. And you know, just talking from this perspective of sites are always wanting volunteers to help out with stuff. You know,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a caveat. We don't want everything from you, but we do want some of your help.
Yeah.
We will want your warm, bloody pulse
Yeah.
coming to our site and helping us with stuff going on. And you know, I think just to kind of start wrapping this up here is like I think this Cliveden thing initiates a really good conversation about what we're doing. I don't think it means the end of battle reenactments. I think it might mean we need to take a look at how we're doing it and maybe push for some change, for better change. Still keep it, but you know, do it gooder, right? You know, it's not the actual you know, end of it. I think a lot of people that, you know, kind of see this as like oh, it's the end of it, good riddance. I think they're a vocal minority. I think most of them are just cynical, and I don't blame them for it, to be honest. A lot of times I understand where they're coming from, but I don't see this as the end of it all here. I mean, I think it just opens up a good conversation as to what we're doing, and hence this is why we've been here for the last hour and 2 hours, whatever it's been.
I'm gonna keep you here forever. It's purgatory.
Dude, I was here for the drinks and the company. I don't know what you guys were here for.
You mean the water we've been drinking? The 100% Aquafina? There's nothing else.
Ben, don't
apple juice.
But one thing I also want to point out, and then I'll do my wrap up spiel, is that there does have to be mutual respect. So reenactors have to respect, and this is, I'm not the first person to say this. Reenactors have to respect not only the sensitivities of a community. So especially like if you have a community of color, you don't want a bunch of Confederate soldiers walking through. You want to respect the local culture and the local. If you have a Jewish section of the Bronx, you don't need to have a World War II you know. But also there needs to be respect, I think, for battle reenactors from historic sites. I think there has been a lot of shade being thrown at battle reenactors by members of the historical public history community because of some of these excesses. But
it's a bit of both. There also needs to be respect to the site. You know, the number one rule as a reenactor is you always respect the site's rules, because I think a lot of us, and like I said, coming from public history, it's like we tend to forget that we're the behest of the site. You know, we're there to help them. It's not the opposite way around. So, you know, we can be angry. Yeah, and we can be angry. We can be upset, disappointed, you know, if we will, with the Cliveden. And I mean, I was supposed to go to Germantown last year and obviously got canceled. And, you know, I'm like, oh, I guess I'll never go. I'm disappointed that I won't get to go, but I'm not mad at them for the decision. For them, it was the best decision at the current time. I think we just kind of get wrapped up that we're here. I'm like, I don't care about, you know, if the site has a rule, I'll follow it. I'm there to be they're at the site for free, do some local history and stay on the grounds, and
Yeah.
you know, anything else is just bonus for me.
Right, and there does need to be mutual rapport. Reenactors, crap talking, historic sites, and vice versa needs to be
Yeah.
part of the end of
Yeah.
the.
People need to like behave.
People need to
And-
behave.
Why
I
can't
think
we
it's-
all just get along?
Because we suck. But anyway.
Everyone needs just a good kitty to cuddle. Well, on that note, guys, I'm going to end it, at least the recorded section. Thank you guys all for tuning in to our ramble. I enjoyed having y'all both, and I definitely hope to have y'all back again for future episodes.
I'm
Especially
game, man.
of the podcast. Yeah, usually they're a little more structured, but I enjoyed this because it didn't need to have structure. It was more of a roundtable, so I enjoyed it. Well, guys, thank you both so much. Good luck with your own academic pursuits and dealing with COVID and also history, which is a problem for all of us. But anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in.